One of the most dramatic episodes in the whole life of Jesus is described in the 8th chapter of John's Gospel. He was preaching one day in front of the temple in Jerusalem, and suddenly he was interrupted by a group of very excited men who had in their midst a disheveled, frightened woman. They said to Jesus in high-pitched voices, "You're not going to believe this, but we just caught this woman in the very act of adultery." Now, we know what Moses said should be done to a tramp like this. What do you say? Well, it was a very awkward interruption. Jesus had had no time whatsoever to prepare for it. And he also realized that these people were not just interested in the law of Moses. They were trying to trap him. They were trying to discredit him in the eyes of the authorities in Jerusalem. To me, it is a sign that Jesus was the incarnation of divine wisdom, to see the way that he responded to this unexpected situation. In fact, the first thing he did was not to answer their question at all, but to stoop over and to begin to write with his finger in the dirt beneath his feet. This is the only time in the Gospels that we're told that Jesus wrote anything, and therefore there has been great interest in what it was that he shaped with his finger. I have a feminist friend in North Carolina who insists he wrote, "Where is the man?" That is a pretty good question, is it not? Because adultery is not something you can do by yourself. Here was a situation where a man and a woman both broke the law of Moses, but given the sexism of the first century, only the woman was being held accountable, only she was going to be punished. And so it was that as Jesus wrote what he did in the dust, I think he was striking a blow against this way of mistreating half of the human family. Someone once said that Jesus knew the difference between adjectives and nouns. Male and female are adjectives. Say something very significant, but it is person, human being, that is the true nominative category. And if you look all through the Gospels, Jesus never engaged in sexism. He gave to every woman he ever met what he gave to every man, and he gave to every woman what he gave to every man. He was really and truly an embracer of the whole human family in the way he related. However, I think there is another explanation for why it was that he may have stooped over to write in the ground. If you'll think about the circumstances of this situation, that frightened woman probably was brought into that public place either carrying her clothes in her hands or badly disheveled. And so it was that in addition to being fearful, not knowing what was going to happen next, she also had the embarrassment of having all of those leering men looking at her in her exposed condition. And I think it may have been an act of incredible, ingenious kindness that caused Jesus to stoop over, and in writing surprisingly in the dust, he was able to deflect the eyes of these men, and therefore gave this woman a blessed chance to get herself together. Now, if this, in fact, is why he wrote into the dust, I think it is simply an expression of something in Jesus that was absolutely essential, and that is his heart was wondrously kind. Jesus never tried to add burdens to the already burdened. Jesus never did do things to people that made it more difficult given the difficult lives that they were living. It was said of Jesus that he never broke a bruised reed. He never quenched a smoldering flax. There was a kindness in Jesus, a kindness that enabled him always to try to do something that would be part of the answer and not part of the problem. And it could be that by deflecting the attention of those men, Jesus gave this one a wonderful chance to at least get herself together again, and therefore conveyed to her, who you are is more important to me finally than anything that you have done. I'd like to suggest that kindness is one of the most creative and powerful things that any of us can do for another human being. And it's not just confined to the first century. It's not just something that happened long ago. Every one of us have within our reach the ability to show kindness and mercy to other people. I heard years ago Fred Craddock tell of an experience that he had several years ago when he was teaching in Oklahoma. He'd had a very busy spring. He was worn out and tired. When the semester was over, he and his wife went back to his native Tennessee, and in order for them to just have a time to reconnect and to recharge their batteries, they took a few days to go up into the Smoky Mountains to a little town called Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And one night they were eating in a wonderful restaurant there, and as they were eating, he noticed a white-haired man away from table to table, obviously the maitre d', and Craddock thought to himself, I hope that man doesn't intrude himself into what we're doing. I'm peopled out. I don't need to be with any more strangers. But sure enough, in due time, the man made his way to their table, and he introduced himself and said, where are you folks from? And Craddock said rather tersely, well, we're from Ada, Oklahoma. He said, what do you do? Well, Craddock thought he would throw him off. He said, I teach homiletics. Now, that's the technical term for the art of preaching. And he thought this mountaineer from Tennessee would not know what it was at all. But to his surprise, the old man said, oh, you teach preaching, do you? I've got a preacher story I need to tell you. And with that, he sat down at the table. Craddock said to himself, oh, my God, not only has he intruded, but now he's going to sit here with us. I've heard all the preacher stories that I ever need for the rest of my life. But the old man continued. He said, I was born not far from here, just across these mountains, and my mother was not married when I was born, and so the shame that fell on her fell on me as well. He said, as long as I can remember, people looked at me askance. When I started to school, my schoolmates had an ugly word they called me that began with a B that I had never heard before. But he said the worst thing was to go with my mother to town on Saturday afternoon, and though people would put their hands over their mouth, I could hear what they were saying. And what they were saying was, I wonder who his daddy is. I wonder who that boy really belongs to. He said, my family and I didn't go to church because we were afraid that people would say, what a trash like you doing in a holy place like this. But he said, when I was 14, a new preacher came to our little mountain church, and I heard him one day in the school chapel, and he was kind, and he was warm, and he was wise, and frankly, I was very taken with him. And so I began to slip into his church after the service started. I would sit down on the back row. I'd be careful to get out before the service was over because I didn't want anybody accusing me of being in the wrong place. But he said one Sunday, I got so enthralled in the sermon that it ended before I realized the service was dismissed. Some old ladies queued up in the back aisle, and so it was impossible for me to get out. And he said, there I was, an unclean person in a place of holiness. And he said, I was so anxious, standing on one foot and then on the other. And he said, as I was standing there, I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder. And I turned around, and who else but the old preacher himself was standing there looking down with me with his piercing blue eyes. He said, whose boy are you, son? Who's your daddy? He said, that was the question that had haunted my whole life. He said, I didn't know what to say. He said, tears came to my eyes, my chin began to quiver. I felt like I was coming to the very end of everything. But he said, before I could say any words, a great smile came on the old preacher's face. And he said, wait a minute, you don't have to tell me. Why, of course, I already know. He said, you are the Son of God. He said, God is your daddy. He said, boy, you have got a great heritage. I want you to go out into the world, and I want you to claim it. The old man said, I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but those two phrases, you are the Son of God, God is your daddy, were the most incredible things that had ever been said to me, and very frankly, they changed the whole course of my life. Well, by this time, even Craddock was enthralled. And he said, what did you say your name was? And the old man said, my name is Ben Hooper. And then Craddock remembered that years before, his grandfather had told him that on 2 occasions, the people of Tennessee had elected as their governor a man who was born out of wedlock. And this claiming the heritage that had been given to him first by the grace of God and then by others gave him a whole new sense of how he viewed himself and how he lived out his life. Now, this was a consummate act of kindness, the kind of kindness that comes straight from the heart of God. And the beautiful thing about this is that every one of us have the capacity, every one of us has the capacity to be kind to everybody that we meet. We may not be able to do heroic things. We may not be brilliant enough to answer every question. We may not have it in our capability to do all kinds of extraordinary feats, but every one of us can choose to be kind to other people, not to burden them who are already burdened. We can be kind, and I want to repeat, of all the creative potencies that we humans have, nothing is any greater than a person saying, what happens to you makes a difference to me, and then extending that person the gift of kindness. I invite you, as I invite myself, to be wondrously kind, to be full of mercy. It may be the very best thing we can ever do with our lives.